Kita menyimak video kesehatan dan keselamatan kerja atau K3 Sekolah Pasca Sarjana Pembangunan Berkelanjutan Universitas Indonesia.
Selamat datang di Universitas Indonesia. Sesuai dengan persyaratan K3L yang berlaku di Universitas Indonesia, kami dari Unit Pelaksana Teknis Keselamatan, Kesehatan Kerja dan Lingkungan Universitas Indonesia akan menyampaikan induksi keselamatan. Saat ini kita berada di Aula Gedung IASTH, Lantai 5, Sekolah Ilmu Lingkungan dan Sekolah Kajian Strategik Global Universitas Indonesia, Salemba. Sebelum melakukan aktivitas di gedung ini, penting kita untuk mengetahui prosedur keselamatan apabila terjadi keadaan darurat.
Terdapat dua potensi keadaan darurat yang mungkin terjadi, yaitu kebakaran dan gempa bumi.
Terdapat 3 pintu keluar dan 1 pintu utama di bagian depan. Jika terjadi kebakaran, mohon tetap tenang dan jangan panik. Segera laporkan sumber api kepada petugas. Jika terlatih untuk memadamkan api, padamkan api dengan apar dekat pintu utama. Dilarang menggunakan lift. Segera lakukan evakuasi ke titik berkumpul melalui tangga darurat. Jika terjadi gempa bumi, mohon tetap tenang dan jangan panik. Lakukan metode drop, cover, and hold. Lindungi kepala, jatuhkan badan Anda, dan berlindung di bawah kursi atau meja. Tetap bertahan hingga gempa reda. Dilarang menggunakan lift. Hindari dari area kaca dan benda yang menggantung. Segera lakukan evakuasi ke titik berkumpul melalui tangga darurat. Berdasarkan keputusan Rektor nomor 1805 tahun 2011, Universitas Indonesia merupakan kawasan tanpa asap rokok. Seluruh warga yang berada di lingkungan Universitas Indonesia dilarang merokok. Jagalah kebersihan di sekitar Anda dan buanglah sampah di tempat yang disediakan. Terima kasih atas perhatian Anda dan selamat melanjutkan aktivitas.
Bapak Ibu, para tamu hadirin, pada kegiatan kali ini kami juga menyediakan penerjemahan bahasa Indonesia ke bahasa Inggris maupun sebaliknya. Bagi peserta yang membutuhkan penerjemahan dapat mengakses alat penerjemahan yang tersedia secara langsung atau yang bergabung melalui Zoom. Boleh memanfaatkan fitur penerjemahan yang ada di Zoom. Akses penerjemahan Zoom, fitur interpretation, dilakukan dengan mengklik icon globe atau di toolbar kontrol rapat, lalu memilih saluran bahasa yang Bapak Ibu peserta inginkan. Kami juga, kajian gender, menyediakan Kids Corner di samping ruangan ini. Pada saat ini, izinkan saya untuk menyapa Bapak Ibu sekali lagi. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan, Rahayu. Yang terhormat, Wakil Direktur Sekolah Pasca Sarjana Pembangunan Berkelanjutan Universitas Indonesia, Dr. Fuad Gani, SSMA. Yang kami hormati, Prodi Kajian Gender Universitas Indonesia, Mbak Mia Siskawati, PSD. Yang kami hormati, Profesor Rebecca Elmhirst, yang berkenan hadir untuk menjadi narasumber kuliah tamu hari ini. Yang saya hormati, Profesor Saparinah Sadli, Profesor Sulistewati Irianto, Profesor Kristi Purwandari, Profesor Ani Sucipto, Profesor Eriseda, Ibu Smita Nato Susanto dari Anugerah Saparinah Sadli, Ketua KOMNAS Perempuan, Ketua KOMNAS HAM, Ketua KOMNAS Perlindungan Anak Indonesia, Bapak Ibu dosen, mahasiswa, alumni, segenap sivitas akademik Universitas Indonesia, para tamu undangan, dan seluruh peserta yang budiman yang berkenan hadir pada kesempatan kali ini. Hadirin yang kami hormati, puji dan syukur marilah kita naikkan kepada Tuhan semesta alam. karena rahmat dan karunia-Nya, kita masih diberikan rasa solidaritas untuk kembali dan menyoal berbagai realitas sosial seperti krisis iklim, konflik agraria yang diakibatkan oleh ekspansi industri ekstraktif. Tentunya realita sosial ini terus berdampak secara khusus bagi kelompok perempuan yang suara dan kedudukannya kerap kali dilihat sebagai objek, sementara pengetahuan dan pengalamannya tidak dilihat sebagai subjek dalam upaya membangun strategi untuk mencapai keadilan sosial. Saat ini juga kita mencukuri perjalanan menyongsong 100 tahun perjalanan Profesor Saparinah Sadli, salah satu pendiri Prodi Kajian Gender Universitas Indonesia dan KOMNAS Perempuan. Tentunya kebahagiaan ini semakin lengkap karena tidak terasa 36 tahun sudah Kajian Gender Universitas Indonesia telah membersamai perjalanan baik dalam ruang akademik maupun praksis di Indonesia dalam upaya mewujudkan kehidupan yang berkeadilan gender. Oleh karena itu, dengan kasih, mari kita mendengarkan sambutan dari Prodi Kajian Gender Universitas Indonesia kepada Mbak Mia Siskawati. Kami silakan.
Ibu bapak semua, suara terdengar ya? Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, teman-teman KOMNAS Perempuan. Saya pinjam salamnya yang bagus sekali. Salam Indonesia yang bineka ya, seperti itu. Baik, teman-teman KOMNAS Perempuan mengusulkan kalau misalnya saya menyebutkan salam Indonesia yang bineka, teman-teman menjawab bineka itu Indonesia. Salam Indonesia yang bineka. Bineka itu Indonesia. Oke, baik. Terima kasih yang saya hormati Profesor Saparinah Sadli yang ada di Zoom. Aduh Ibu, senang sekali Ibu bisa bergabung didampingi oleh Mbak Smita Noto Susanto dari Anugerah Saparinah Sadli. Mbak Smita khusus datang ke rumah Ibu Saparinah Sadli untuk mendampingi Ibu. Baik, kemudian Profesor Sulistyowati Irianto, Mbak Sulis, Prof. Kristri Purwandari, Mbak Kristi, Prof. Anis Cipto, Prof. Edi Seda mungkin bergabung online. Ada Prof. Meling Oid, terima kasih Prof. Ini para senior kami yang membersamai program studi kajian gender dari waktu yang sangat lama. Di sini ada Mbak Rita Serena Kalibonso, Mbak Rita selaku Wakil Ketua Komisi Kejaksaan RI sekaligus juga dari Anugerah Saparinah Sadli. Mungkin hadir ada Mbak Maria Ketua KOMNAS Perempuan, kemudian kami juga mengundang Mbak Anis Ketua KOMNAS HAM, ada Teh Ai dari KOMNAS Perlindungan Anak Indonesia, kemudian juga ada tentu di sini ada teman-teman kolega dosen, mahasiswa, alumni segenap sivitas akademika Universitas Indonesia, ada kawan-kawan dari beberapa universitas di Philippines, Dazel, thank you, ada juga Profesor Babet dari Kanada, thank you. Tentu saja kakak-kakak semua, para tamu undangan dan seluruh peserta yang budiman. Terima kasih banyak atas partisipasi Anda semua. Tercatat registrasi sampai 1 jam yang lalu ada 541 pendaftar dan Becky, oh my god. Yang hadir online, kalau dari pendaftaran ada 388 peserta, tapi kami tetap membuka, jadi bisa saja pesertanya bertambah banyak. Yang mendaftar untuk datang ke sini ada 146 peserta. Kalaupun masih ada teman yang datang, kami akan tetap membuka teman-teman untuk datang. Sekali lagi selamat datang di acara Saparinah Sadli Distinguished Lecture. Ini adalah satu kegiatan yang sejak mungkin beberapa waktu lalu kami ingin selenggarakan dan ini bersambung semesta, kemudian bersambung teman-teman Anugerah Saparinah Sadli, Mbak Smita, Mbak Rita dan teman-teman kakak-kakak semua yang dari Saparinah Anugerah Saparinah Sadli memang ingin menyelenggarakan rangkaian acara dalam rangka menyambut 100 tahun Profesor Saparinah Sadli. Jadi ini seperti gayung bersambut sekaligus untuk menyongsong ulang tahun program studi kajian gender ke-36. Masih cukup lama, tetapi ini adalah tahun program studi kajian gender akan memasuki usia ke-36. Saya ingin menjelaskan sedikit karena masih ada yang ketukar pusat studi dengan program studi. Jadi masih ada banyak teman-teman, oh ada program S2 kajian gender ya. Saya ingin gunakan kesempatan ini untuk, ini promosi ya, boleh ya. Jadi menjelaskan program studi kajian gender adalah program studi yang menyelenggarakan magister. Program magister kajian gender ini kebetulan yang pertama di Indonesia dan sehingga menjadi yang tertua, dan nanti ada 2 program studi lain di 2 universitas yang lain, dan hadir kelihatannya bersama saya. Terima kasih Prof Nini dan kawan-kawan dari program studi kajian gender dan pembangunan Universitas Hasanuddin. Terima kasih Prof Nini dan kawan-kawan kolega dosen di program studi kajian gender dan pembangunan di Universitas Hasanuddin. Kemudian hadir pula Mbak Maharani, Ketua Program Studi Kajian Wanita, ini juga S2 di Universitas Brawijaya, juga bertemu teman-teman kolega dosen. Terima kasih Mbak Rani dan teman-teman kolega dosen di Program Studi Kajian Wanita Universitas Brawijaya. Dan tentu saja juga ada peminatan, jadi ada peminatan di beberapa program studi termasuk di Universitas Airlangga dan juga di beberapa universitas lain. Mulai ada peminatan walaupun belum menjadi program studi. Kalau pusat studi adalah lembaga penelitian yang memang ada di seluruh, biasanya ada di seluruh universitas. Pusat studi kajian wanita, kajian gender, atau juga kajian perempuan dan anak. Nah, sebetulnya sudah menjadi perhatian bagi program studi kajian gender isu-isu yang terkait dengan isu sumber daya alam, isu lingkungan hidup, dan isu yang terkait dengan penghidupan. Dan kami beruntung karena kami kedatangan tamu Profesor Rebecca Elmhirst. Ini kawan lama dan juga kawan lama dari program studi kajian gender sebetulnya. Nanti Becky akan cerita bagaimana pengalaman Becky dengan program studi kajian gender bekerja sama ya. Dan kebetulan saya juga pernah bekerja sama dengan Becky dalam satu penelitian tentang bagaimana posisi perempuan dan juga bagaimana posisi kelompok marjinal lain di dalam perkebunan kelapa sawit. Becky sendiri adalah seseorang yang sudah lama sebetulnya menekuni isu dinamika politik, ekologi penghidupan dan keadilan sosial di Indonesia dan di Asia Tenggara melalui perspektif feminis. Becky penelitian S3-nya itu di Lampung, di daerah Transmigran Lampung. Jadi Becky bisa berbahasa Indonesia. Walaupun untuk kuliah Becky akan menggunakan bahasa Inggris. Dulu Becky bisa bahasa Jawa karena tuan rumahnya adalah transmigran dari Jawa Tengah ya, seperti itu. Tapi kayaknya lupa ya, udah lupa bahasa Jawanya ya. Baik, oke. Dengan tidak berlama-lama karena juga ingin kita dengarkan bersama-sama. Tapi izinkan saya ingin menyampaikan bahwa kuliah ini, kegiatan ini secara khusus memang didedikasikan untuk mengenang jasa dan teladan dari Profesor Saparinah Sadli yang sebetulnya beliau menjadi ibu bagi tidak hanya bagi kajian gender, tentu saja juga menjadi ibu bagi gerakan perempuan di Indonesia, termasuk menjadi salah satu pendiri dan ketua pertama dari KOMNAS Perempuan. Bagi kami Profesor Saparinah Sadli menjadi betul-betul orang yang selalu memberikan teladan. Sampai usia ini Ibu masih rajin membaca dan mengajak kami diskusi, mendengarkan berbagai perkembangan situasi politik, sosial politik di Indonesia, dan itu luar biasa. Kami akan mungkin menutupnya dengan nanti ada sedikit video profil dari Ibu yang disiapkan oleh teman-teman dari Anugerah Saparinah Sadli. Sekali lagi terima kasih banyak atas partisipasi semuanya. Dan bagi kawan-kawan mungkin yang ada online, jika berminat untuk mendaftar menjadi mahasiswa program studi kajian gender, tanggal 23 Februari nanti akan dibuka gelombang yang pertama. Bagi teman-teman bisa mengakses beasiswa LPDP dan mudah-mudahan bisa bergabung dengan kami, keluarga besar Kajian Gender Universitas Indonesia. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih kepada Mbak Mia. Selanjutnya mari bersama kita menyaksikan pemutaran video perjalanan singkat Profesor Saparinah Sadli.
Saparinah Sadli lahir pada 24 Agustus 1926 di Desa Tegalsari, Jawa Tengah. Saparinah memulai karirnya sebagai apoteker setelah lulus dari Fakultas Farmasi Universitas Gadjah Mada pada tahun 1953. Ia kemudian mendalami ilmu psikologi pada kursus psikologi UI yang menjadi cikal bakal Fakultas Psikologi Universitas Indonesia. Pada 1954, Saparinah menikah dengan Muhammad Sadli, seorang dosen muda di Fakultas Ekonomi Universitas Indonesia yang kemudian menjadi guru besar di fakultas yang sama dan Menteri Tenaga Kerja dan Menteri Pertambangan RI. Saparinah meraih gelar doktor pada ilmu psikologi dan dipilih menjadi dekan Fakultas Psikologi UI pada periode 1976 sampai 1981. Ia dilantik menjadi guru besar pada tahun 1985. Perhatiannya pada kesetaraan gender mendorongnya untuk membentuk program studi kajian wanita program pasca sarjana Universitas Indonesia pada tahun 1990 yang merupakan pendidikan jenjang S2 dalam studi gender pertama di Indonesia. Di lembaga inilah ia mendidik dan memimpin program studi ini sampai tahun 2004. Tahun 1996, Saparinah Sadli terpilih menjadi anggota Komisi Nasional Hak Asasi Manusia, KOMNAS HAM, dan pada periode 1998 sampai 2002, Saparinah terpilih menjadi Wakil Ketua KOMNAS HAM. Kerusuhan Mei 1998 yang mengakibatkan jatuhnya korban di kalangan perempuan Tionghoa mendorong Saparinah untuk memimpin 22 orang tokoh perempuan yang tergabung dalam masyarakat anti kekerasan menghadap Presiden B.J. Habibie pada Juli 1998 dan memaksa pemerintah meminta maaf atas kekerasan seksual yang dialami banyak perempuan di tengah kerusuhan itu. Atas advokasi yang dipimpin Saparinah, Presiden Habibie setuju untuk membentuk tim gabungan pencari fakta untuk menyelidiki peristiwa kekerasan seksual terhadap perempuan Tionghoa dan sekaligus meminta maaf atas nama negara atas kejadian tersebut. Saparinah ditunjuk untuk menjadi anggota TGPF tersebut. Atas dorongan Saparinah, Presiden Habibie memutuskan pembentukan Komisi Nasional Anti Kekerasan Terhadap Perempuan yang kemudian populer disebut sebagai KOMNAS Perempuan. Untuk kiprahnya dalam berbagai aktivitas, Busap memperoleh banyak penghargaan. Di antaranya adalah Bintang Mahaputra Nararya yang dianugerahkan oleh Presiden Megawati pada tahun 2002, The Asia Special Lifetime Achievement Award 2008, Cendekiawan Berdedikasi Harian Kompas 2009, Nabil Nation Building Award 2012, Ruseno Award 2017, Ahmad Bakri Award, dan Anugerah Sri Kandi Indonesia untuk Life Achievement dari Kompas TV tahun 2025. Setelah pensiun, Saparinah masih tetap aktif menggagas berbagai aktivitas dan kegiatan untuk mendukung pemenuhan hak asasi perempuan. Ia turut mendirikan Yayasan Kesehatan Perempuan, YKP, pada tahun 2001 yang berfokus pada pemenuhan hak-hak kesehatan reproduksi perempuan. Saparinah menaruh perhatian besar pada kualitas hidup perempuan lansia. Hal ini ditunjukkan dengan menulis buku Menjadi Perempuan Sehat dan Produktif di Usia Lanjut, 2007. Ia juga turut mendirikan Sahabat Lansia Tangguh dan sampai kini aktif dalam berbagai kegiatannya.
Sampaikan itu, jangan melecehkan lansia.
Ya.
Lansia yang di antara 60 sampai 90 tahun adalah kelompok yang sangat beragam. Kita hari ini menyaksikannya. Kita jangan dianggap sebagai orang yang tidak bisa berpikir lagi, yang tidak mau membantu sesuatu dan lain sebagainya.
Menyelenggarakan Saparinah Sadli Distinguished Lecture yang secara langsung disampaikan oleh Prof. Rebecca Elmhirst, University of Brighton, UK, dengan judul Feminist Political Ecology as a Convening Space Challenging Times. Untuk itu, dengan kasih, mari kita mendengarkan sambutan Profesor Saparinah Sadli yang sudah hadir bersama kita di sore hari ini melalui via Zoom. Sudah terdengar, Bu?
Selamat sore. Maaf, saya tidak bisa hadir karena
Kedengeran, Kak? Terdengar.
Sudah terdengar, Bu?
Selamat sore. Maaf, saya tidak bisa hadir karena sudah tidak lagi terbiasa keluar rumah. Terima kasih kepada seluruh jajaran program studi kajian wanita yang telah menyelenggarakan acara ini. Ini inisiatif yang luar biasa. Terima kasih pada Ibu Rebecca yang bersedia membawakan pidato tentang topik yang penting ini. Terima kasih pada para hadirin yang telah hadir. Selamat menyaksikan.
Terima kasih Ibu, doa kami sehat terus dan bahagia menyongsong 100 tahun perjalanan yang Tuhan sudah anugerahkan. Selanjutnya, mari kita dengarkan sambutan dari Wakil Direktur Sekolah Pasca Sarjana Pembangunan Berkelanjutan Universitas Indonesia yang sudah bergabung secara langsung. Mohon dengan kasih kepada Dr. Fuad Gani SSMA. Kepada Bapak kami persilahkan.
Itu wakil.
Baik. Baik. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Untuk kita semua, yang terhormat Ibu kita semua yang senior, orang yang sangatnya tokoh legendaris dalam perjuangan menyangkut tentang wanita, Ibu kita semua, Ibu Profesor Saparinah Sadli. Kemudian juga tentu saja Ibu Profesor Sulistiowati, Ibu Profesor Kristi, Profesor Ani Suyuto, Profesor Eri Seda, Ibu Mita Notosunto, Ketua KOMNAS Perempuan, Ketua KOMNAS HAM, Ketua Komunitas Perlindungan Anak Indonesia, Ibu dosen, mahasiswa, alumni, segenap aktivitas akademi Universitas Indonesia dan juga di luar Indonesia, banyak dari tamu-tamu tentunya hadir dari Brawijaya, kemudian dari beberapa para tamu undangan dan seluruh peserta yang kami hormati. Selamat datang dalam acara Saparinah Sadli Distinguished Lecture yang diselenggarakan oleh Prodi Kajian Gender, Departemen Kajian Strategik Ketahanan dan Keamanan, Sekolah Pascasarjana Pembangunan Berkelanjutan Universitas Indonesia. Kami sangat menyambut baik acara yang luar biasa ini, bentuk suatu kehormatan kepada seseorang yang telah memberikan dedikasi pengabdian yang luar biasa bagi kemajuan negeri ini, bangsa ini, khususnya para kaum wanita, kaum perempuan yang menyelenggarakannya tentu suatu hal yang luar biasa dalam rangka menyongsong 100 tahun Profesor Saparinah Sadli. Biasanya kalau mereka yang sudah diberikan usia sampai di atas 90, biasanya doanya sangat dikabulkan gitu. Jadi mohon Bu, kami juga kalian berdoa, mudah-mudahan juga program studi kami terus berlanjut. Yang merupakan Ibu adalah salah satu pendiri program kajian Gender UI, KOMNAS Perempuan. Kita dalam rangka menyongsong 30 tahun program kajian gender Sekolah Pembangunan Berkelanjutan Universitas Indonesia yang merupakan pada intinya adalah integrasi dari dua sekolah yang ada sebelumnya. Acara Saparinah Sadli Distinguished Lecture seri pertama dan tentunya diharapkan ada seri-seri berikutnya pada hari ini diisi oleh salah satu juga tokoh yang mendedikasikan keilmuannya bagi hal-hal yang menyangkut isu dan masalah wanita, Profesor Rebecca dari Universitas Brighton, United Kingdom, yang akan membawakan kuliah umum dengan judul Feminist Political Ecology as a Convening Space in Challenging Times. Terima kasih tentunya kami ucapkan dengan Ibu Rebecca yang telah menyiapkan, kemudian menjalankan selama ini juga terlibat secara langsung dan bahkan dikatakan oleh Ibu Mia pernah, mudah-mudahan masih bisa dipertahankan keterampilannya, kepastian dalam berbahasa Jawa, untuk kesediaan bertindak sebagai narasumber dalam kegiatan ini. Materi yang akan dibawakan oleh Profesor Rebecca merupakan materi yang sangat penting. Kajian tentang masalah lingkungan hidup dan penghidupan berbasis sumber daya alam dengan menggunakan perspektif gender. Itu sesuatu variatif. Jadi selama ini hanya dari perspektif bisa aja ekonomi, kemudian culture, tapi ini adalah spatial perspektif gender dan intersectionalitasnya sangat dibutuhkan, baik untuk pengembangan ilmu pengetahuan, untuk penyusunan kebijakan yang tentu sampai hanya batasnya bukan hanya nasional, tetapi juga bisa internasional, dan program pemerintah maupun untuk menguatkan kapasitas masyarakat dalam konteks pembangunan berkelanjutan. Kami percaya bahwa lecture ini suatu presentasi yang ditunggu-tunggu dan didengarkan dengan sangat serius nantinya untuk menjadi suatu bukan hanya sebagai motivasi, tetapi inspirasi bagi perjuangan gender Indonesia, sehingga keinginan kesetaraan gender dapat tercapai di mana setiap wanita tentunya mempunyai hak yang sama dengan kaum laki. Dan kita sudah melihat bahwa kita juga bersyukur ada di Indonesia kita punya presiden wanita Ibu Megawati ya. Jadi dengan demikian kami mengharap acara ini akan berlangsung lancar untuk memberikan semacam wawasan yang lebih luas tentang gender. Selamat mengikuti kuliah yang akan diberikan oleh Profesor Rebecca. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat sore.
Selamat sore Bapak. Terima kasih banyak kepada Bapak. Mohon berkenan untuk tetap berada di ruang Zoom bersama dengan semua peserta, para undangan, teman-teman mahasiswa. Kita berdiri di tempat sejenak. Kita akan mengambil gambar untuk mengabadikan momen saat ini. Silakan teman-teman panitia. Kita akan mengambil gambar di pertengahan acara ini. Mohon Bapak Wakil Direktur tetap berada di Zoom. Silakan Bapak Ibu semua peserta yang ada di dalam ruangan ini, silakan berdiri ya. Silakan berdiri, kita ambil gambar bersama. Teman-teman panitia boleh mengambil tempat. Dalam hitungan ketiga, mari berikan senyuman yang terbaik di sore hari ini. 1, 2, 3. Oke, sekali lagi lebih santai, tidak foto KTP, berikan senyuman yang terbaik. 1, 2, 3, cheese. Ya, oke. Sekali lagi, panitia. Oke. Baik, terima kasih untuk senyuman yang terbaik di sore hari ini. Disilakan untuk duduk kembali. Baik, Bapak Ibu, para tamu undangan, para hadirin, dan teman-teman mahasiswa. Ini sesi yang kita tunggu-tunggu karena kuliah tamu akan berlangsung. Supaya kita tidak mengantuk, kita tidak lelah, para panitia sudah bekerja keras, ada minuman di belakang, ada makanan yang bisa untuk dikonsumsi. Sekiranya Bapak Ibu berkenan untuk mengambil dan akhirnya kembali lagi untuk kita bersama-sama memasuki sesi yang kita tunggu-tunggu, kuliah tamu di sore hari ini. Dan pemaparan materi ini akan disampaikan oleh Profesor Rebecca menggunakan bahasa Inggris. Sekali lagi saya mengingatkan untuk peserta yang membutuhkan penerjemahan dapat mengakses alat penerjemahan yang tersedia secara langsung, atau teman-teman para peserta yang bergabung melalui via Zoom dapat mengakses melalui fitur interpretation, dilakukan dengan mengklik icon yang tersedia melalui toolbar kontrol rapat, lalu memilih saluran bahasa yang diinginkan. Baik Bapak Ibu para hadirin, kuliah tamu kali ini akan dimoderatori oleh Dr. Haryati Sinaga. Mbak Haryati adalah dosen di Kajian Gender Universitas Indonesia. Dengan berfokus pada perspektif ekonomi politik feminis, beliau memusatkan perhatian pada persinggungan antara relasi gender dan relasi kerja. Mbak Haryati telah hadir bersama kita di sore hari ini. Oleh karena itu dengan kasih kami persilahkan untuk berkenan mengambil tempat di depan dan memandu jalannya perkuliahan di sore hari ini. Mari kita menyambut Mbak Haryati di depan dengan memberikan tepuk tangan pada sore hari ini.
Selamat sore kakak-kakak semua. Kalau di kajian gender kita biasa panggil kakak-kakak biar lebih netral ya. Saya diminta oleh panitia untuk memandu diskusi kita selama 90 menit ke depan. Dan dalam perjalanan saya ke sini tadi, dan mungkin juga kakak-kakak yang juga sudah hadir ataupun yang sedang dalam perjalanan juga mungkin tadi mengalami apa yang saya alami gitu ya. Sedang mempertimbangkan rute-rute mana yang harus saya lewati karena tiba-tiba hujan besar. Dan tentunya seperti yang kita tahu, bulan-bulan ini adalah bulan-bulan yang merupakan keresahan buat warga Jabodetabek gitu kan, karena puncak dari musim hujan, dan bukan hanya karena persoalan puncak musim hujan ya, tetapi intensitas hujan dan persoalan iklim menjadi ramai lagi dibicarakan. Dan terutama kalau kita mengingat apa yang terjadi yang dialami oleh kawan-kawan kita di Sumatera gitu ya, ada persoalan-persoalan lingkungan, krisis iklim, bukan hanya persoalan krisis hidrometeorologi ya, tetapi juga itu semua faktor-faktor yang berkelindanan. Dan ini kemudian yang mungkin dalam 2 atau 3 bulan ini ya, belakangan kakak-kakak mengikuti gitu ya, isu lingkungan kembali menjadi topik perdebatan, bagaimana relasi kita, mempertimbangkan bagaimana relasi kita dengan alam, dan bukan hanya bagaimana relasi kita dengan alam, tetapi juga kelindahannya dengan relasi kita dengan sesama manusia. Dan di dalam perbincangan itu yang mungkin kalau kakak perhatikan yang sedikit itu pun hanya memberikan fokus yang sedikit gitu ya, adalah bagaimana dampak dari persoalan-persoalan akses terhadap sumber daya alam, kemudian isu lingkungan terhadap perempuan, kelompok marjinal. Itu yang seringkali luput dari perhatian. Dan kali ini itu adalah salah satu yang mungkin akan kita dengarkan dan pelajari, mungkin diskusikan bersama-sama dengan seorang scholar, tadi sudah diperkenalkan oleh Mbak Mia juga, yaitu adalah Profesor Rebecca Elmhirst. Saya bacakan dulu profil beliau. Profesor Rebecca Elmhirst atau biasa kita panggil Becky di sini adalah seorang profesor dari Human Geography di School of Applied Science at University of Brighton, UK. Beliau adalah seorang ahli geografi manusia, human geographer, dan merupakan ekologi politik feminis dengan latar belakang yang sangat panjang ya, sekitar 3 dekade dalam riset dan juga mengajar isu-isu tentang lingkungan, tata kelola lingkungan, penghidupan dan juga keadilan sosial. Dan karya-karya beliau itu juga banyak menggunakan perspektif interseksionalitas dalam mengkaji bagaimana keterlindahan ataupun akses terhadap sumber daya alam dan kaitannya dengan penghidupan atau penghidupan berbasis sumber daya alam. Dan saat ini fokus riset dari beliau adalah mempelajari, memahami proses-proses migrasi yang bergender gitu ya dalam konteks penghidupan dan hubungannya dengan perampasan ruang hidup, dan ini juga yang menjadi menarik ya, nantinya mungkin akan kita diskusikan dalam konteks ekspansi perkebunan sawit. Ada banyak sekali tulisan dan karya ilmiah yang sudah beliau sudah terbitkan gitu ya. Jadi mungkin juga buat teman-teman mahasiswa di sini sudah banyak juga menggunakan pemikiran, termasuk saya juga pemikiran beliau, sehingga kami sangat mengapresiasi sekali kehadiran beliau saat ini. Saya mau mengundang Becky bersama saya ke depan, silakan. Kita berikan tepuk tangan. So, Becky, we will have around 45 minutes to give your talk, and then afterwards there will be some timer to time is yours, Becky.
Yeah, just 1 minute. I'm fiddle with the technology, but thank you very much, everybody. I'm so honored to be here. 1 minute. Oh, okay. Yeah, maybe while they're doing that, I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me to be here. What an honor to be here to celebrate Professor Sadli has won her 100 years. And I very first met Professor Saparinah Sadli when I was just in my PhD, so back in 1996, and I came to Kajian Wanita, as it was known then, just to kind of, I was already researching about gender, and I wanted to understand, I wanted to know more. And what a find, Kajian Wanita and Professor Saparinah. So already I think the title of this talk is about feminist political ecology as a convening space. But I want to say thank you to Kajian Gender for being a really important convening space. For me, for others who've passed through Indonesia, for everybody in this room, but also beyond the university, and how important that has been for everybody. So I'm so honored and so delighted to see Professor Sadli looking so strong just now in the connection. So thank you very much for that opportunity. And also to say thank you to Mia, Miss Mia, Mia, for inviting me. And it was a fortunate coincidence that I was coming to talk also about future collaborations. So the collaborations continue, and to coincide with having this opportunity to speak to you all. So I hope you can hear me okay. I'm moving the microphone a little bit, so please bear with me. I want to apologize also for speaking in Bahasa Inggris. Maaf, mohon maaf, the colonizer language. And I'm really sorry, Matmia, I can't speak Javanese. I can say Monggo. I think that's about as good. But Bahasa Indonesia, a little but very informal. So a little bit Bahasa Petani rather than Bahasa for an event like this. But I started my sort of PhD journey back in 1990s. So I was here in those events in 1998, which was terrible. And I think this was when I also experienced the strength of feminism in Indonesia, even though at that time it was difficult to use that word. So I'm so happy to see how much this area has grown. And so when I'm talking now, I'm talking really about some learning that I've done with you, with Kajian Gender, but also learning with and through the communities that I've worked with and had the privilege to do fieldwork with in Indonesia. So what I want to do in my talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about feminist political ecology as an area. And I realize that for many people, this is not anything new. So my apologies if some of this is familiar to you. But sometimes I think we misunderstand what feminist political ecology can be. So really what I want to talk about today is not so much about what feminist political ecology is, but about what feminist political ecology does in terms of the ethics of how we work together. So that's why I called this a convening space in challenging times. And we already heard what these challenges are. We don't need to name them. They are in our lives all the time, some of which becoming more prominent as every day passes. And they're not just environmental, they're political as well. So the struggle is very big. And so in a way, the more we can work together and the more we can connect, the more we have an opportunity to really build something, continue to build something in an inclusive way that is respectful of all voices and all positions. So taking this more kind of intersectional way of thinking. So I'm going to use this lecture really to sort of outline some of the kind of contours of feminist political ecology. Is it moving? No. Oh yeah. So I'm starting really by talking about, well, what or where is feminist political ecology? And so, more close? Oh, my apologies. It feels very loud to me at the stop here. So I'm going to outline the contours of feminist political ecology. And I referenced there a book which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen called Contours of Feminist Political Ecology. And this was an outcome of another convening space which ended fairly recently, or continues actually, as we continue to work together. And that term contours really reflects the fact that there is no one feminist political ecology. It's a collection of different ideas, people coming to this question of gender, environment, people, nature, politics, from all sorts of different perspectives and angles and histories and different geographies. So it's very difficult in some ways to give a short summary of what feminist political ecology is. But I'm a teacher, and that's my job, is to produce simple sort of simple representations that we can then unpick and unravel. By the way, the QR code, there's no money involved in this. It's an open access book, but I thought if you were interested, you might want to use the QR code because you can get access to this book if you were interested. There's a lot of Indonesian scholars in here, so Siti Maimuna, Dian Ekawati, so please help yourself. So the phrase feminist political ecology was actually first used in academia by Dian Rochelot. So this book on the left-hand side, Feminist Political Ecology, was published in the early 1990s. It's a textbook that I've used a lot with my students. And in fact, even in that early version of feminist political ecology, we already see that it's very much based on community knowledges. It's very much based on learning with and from people rather than being an extractive researcher that comes and takes from communities. So already those feminist principles of how we work were being mapped out. And Dian Rochelot has defined feminist political ecology as a community of practice that links academic research, lived experience, and action. And I think that's a really great starting point for really understanding what feminist political ecology is, but also hints at what it does. And then in terms of what it does, feminist political ecology is a convening space in another way, which is it convenes a number of tools for critical analysis and of the deepening global environmental, economic and political crises, but also tools for analysing those responses. What do those responses mean? Can they work? How can we learn from each other as well? And so in today's talk, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a illustrated guide to how we might understand some of those tools and how they work. And what they share is centering on questions of power, inequality, and justice. And that's the kind of thread that runs through when we think about political ecology and what we're doing. So when we're talking about issues such as dispossession, resource access and control, these are issues faced by marginalized rural communities in the global south. And a lot of feminist political ecology has been built from the experiences of women in these kinds of communities. But there are other roots from which feminist political ecology has grown. Another we might think of as coming from the community knowledges within in the United States, from the Black civil rights activism, which brought with this concept of intersectionality that we found so powerful, and I'll speak some more about that in a moment. Also, Indigenous rights and anti-colonial ecological movements. So it's a movement knowledge as well as an academic knowledge. And these have also extended the different branches of feminist political ecology. And in the book, The Contours of Feminist Political Ecology, what we try to do is avoid a singular narrative of what FPE is and instead think about what it does. So we tried in some ways to trace some of the roots and look at where we all were coming from our different situated perspectives. But it was very much trying to avoid closing down the conversation and saying, well, this is what it is, and that's the end of the story. If you're an academic, you put a reference in your thesis, and then you close the door. No, that's not how we work. So it's about keeping that door open for new ideas and the power of conversations when they're had in common. So focusing a little bit more on feminist political ecology and what it does. And here's where a question that I'm often asked, often by people who think, well, what's feminism got to do with anything? And I'm hoping that question's gone away. Probably in this room, that's not a question we're asking. But there are many spaces that I'm sure you'll find yourself working in or living in where people say, well, what is this? What is this thing called feminism? Sometimes felt as being quite threatening. So I think something that I found really helpful was at a meeting a couple of years ago where I was one of the participants, Hallie Tufan, shared some learning from bell hooks about what feminism is. And she says, I've wanted them to have an answer to the question, what is feminism? That is rooted neither in fear or fantasy. I've wanted them to have this simple definition to read again and again so they know. Feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. Well, we heard this from Professor Sadli's life and how much she's been committed to that, even though perhaps that word feminism wasn't necessarily used all the time and in all of the different spaces that she was working. So, yeah, great connection to Kajian Gender there. And Bell Hooks goes on to say, I love this definition, which I first offered more than 10 years ago in my book, Feminist Theory, From Margin to Center. I love it because it so clearly states that the movement is not about being anti-male. It makes it clear that the problem is sexism. In other words, it's a problem for all of us, for all humanity. And I found that helpful also for the networks that I've worked in, where actually men are also a part of these networks quite often, and to think about how actually doing feminist political ecology involves a particular kind of ethics, a commitment to feminist values and an ethics of care. Care in regard to how we do our research, care to each other, care in action, and how important that is. And then a recognition of the interdependency of all life. This is perhaps where these questions around nature and the environment come in, is to see that in relational terms, that we don't just have this environment that we just use and exploit, but to see that as something in a more holistic way, perhaps unlearning some damaging ways in which we think about those relationships and relearn a more responsive, reciprocal relationship for securing the conditions for sustainable and the flourishing of Earth relations. And here I think you see the connection between feminist political ecology and ecofeminism. So sometimes there's much of a binary that's driven between ecofeminism and feminist political ecology. I want to argue that binary is maybe a false binary, and there are ways in which these are two different ways of different emphases maybe, but they're coming from the same spirit. Feminist political ecology, I think where it perhaps is more explicitly political is in terms of challenging dominant practices of knowledge and authority. So it's not only about politics with a capital P, but also about those, I don't know how this translates, epistemic politics, the politics of knowledge, how we know, what we know, how we see the world, and how those can be incredibly damaging. And in some ways where we are right now with the climate crisis, perhaps is a reflection of those epistemic politics. And then obviously an emphasis on environmental and social justice for all marginalized people. And that includes in the global north. So I think it's really important to not see this as a sort of north-south divide, and the north is entirely made up of people of privilege, and that there is actually something else going on there, and that relationship between coloniality, class, and gender, which I'll say more about in a moment, complicates those very simple ways of understanding the global north, but also helps us to understand where potential connections can be made, which is something I think we should also find valuable. So turning now to, did I go backwards? Turning now to another sort of aspect about how we do feminist political ecology is around thinking about how we work together. And this influence of feminist critiques of scientific objectivity, decolonial thinking, women's environmental justice movements have combined in a powerful question that underlies work in feminist political ecology. Who counts as a knowledge producer? It forces us to reflect on our situatedness within thorny knowledge politics, particularly paying attention to whose voices and lived experiences inform our understandings of the world. This shapes what questions are asked and why, our methods, our interpretations. So the examples here are of the rooted, situated networks of learners. Think of myself as a learner, but also the people I'm talking with and engaging with of learning together. These photographs here are of some of the different rooted networks that I've been involved in and that have brought me to Indonesia for various occasions, working with communities. So on the top left one is with community in Lampung, who I still have some connection with, right back from 1994 when I was just a young girl. And then I think, Mia, might you recognize yourself there? A community, situated network in Kalimantan at that time, when we were researching impacts on women of oil palm expansion not so long ago. And then, Batmai, you might recognize yourself, and Diana Kawati there. This is in Brighton. And this is another network, a situated network that grew from a research project that linked up a whole lot of activists, PhD students, university staff from 15 different countries in Europe and in other parts of the world as well. And this was one little part of this, was some work which actually Mai very much initiated, Siti Maimuna very much initiated, with the work that she'd been doing with on coal mining, and we had an exhibition. I'll talk some more about that later, but this became really an important connection. And in the background there, you can't quite see her, but Alice Owen, who's also was part of this and was researching extractivism in the UK, literally just 10 miles up the road, where there's trying to drill for oil. So these are issues that are not just in Global South. Extraction is something that we are all being subjected to, and our job in that where we were starting to ask questions is, do the questions we ask in the UK, are they different from the kinds of questions we ask in Indonesia? Or where are the points of connection? Where do they pull apart? And then finally, the last one is literally from yesterday, building new sort of rooted networks, which questions we might ask. So with Babette Resurrection, and who I've worked with a long, long time. So Babette has been a bit of my, holding my hand. We've been holding hands with our research for many years, but we're starting to ask new questions here, linking communities in the Philippines and Indonesia, and how bringing these sort of pluralistic networks of learners together is challenging, but also incredibly rewarding. So we're looking forward to thinking about ways in which how the questions that we ask should emerge from the communities, but then how to translate and communicate across different spaces as well. And I think that's the challenge for feminist political ecology as a convening space, is to enable that to happen, and what we need to do to make sure that happens. So, I want to sorry, I'm probably halfway through, but I want to move now into a little bit the content, or rather the tools of feminist political ecology, and to think about this quote from Donna Haraway: "It matters what stories tell stories," and that, which sounds very simple when you first hear it, and then you think, what does she mean? What is she meaning when she says that? And I think what she means, Donna Haraway has been quite influential in feminist political ecology. She suggests in her book, Staying with the Trouble, that the stories we choose and the stories which choose us. I feel like Indonesia chose me in a way. I don't know how that happened, but I chose Indonesia, and then I never could leave. So it's shapes very much. These stories shape the stories how we understand and tell other stories. I suppose what I'm saying is so much of what I've learned from working in Lampung has really given shape to the questions I've asked when I've taken myself into other environments and when I've started to collaborate with other people, that you kind of start to feel these stories blending and shaping you in various kinds of ways. So it also, I think, helps think about some of the tools that we use, these analytical tools that are so powerful, because choosing those tools has also been something to be mindful about, because that also shapes the kind of stories that get heard, and how important that is. And so I'm wanting to illustrate feminist political ecology's critical tools by actually borrowing someone else's story. This is Ibu Magdalena Pandan. She's pictured in this photograph here. She's not really my story to tell. It's her story to tell, but it was also a story that was gathered through a collaboration with Dian Ekawati, Bimbika Sijapati Basnet, and Amir Siskawati also working on this project. This from West Kalimantan. So I want to thank Ibu Magdalena Pandan for sharing her story, which was a life in a day in the life of an oil palm worker. And I think her story really shows the power that feminist political ecology tools can have for really understanding people's situations. So this is what I want to kind of explore here. So just to summarize those shared critical tools in feminist political ecology, these are the tools that I think are so key for showing how environmental crises, human environmental relations, are determined by power, gender, class, race, ethnicity, caste, specific socioeconomic and cultural and historical legacies, often embedded within particular landscapes. And so FPE has sort of emerged from this critical analysis of environmental science, environmental rights, consumption, distribution of resources. And in a lot of political ecology generally, much of the work has involved serving the goal of critique, diagnosing the problem, understanding systemic power, seeing how this plays out and is being addressed in specific contexts. And these shared tools that are most often used within feminist political ecology, I think, open the conversation in different ways. So thinking from intersecting forms of power. So when we talk about gender, we're not using this in a singular way, but we're looking instead at what intersectionality does, how those forms of power, patriarchy, racism, class, ableism, colonialism, how these affect the conditions of possibility, the material outcomes in terms of people's roles, responsibilities, ecological and bodily health, access to and control of resources at different scales. Intersectionality, I think, is a really critical tool for all of us. And it's one that I feel has evolved a lot in gender studies generally, but I think in feminist political ecology in particular. And that's really come from a learning from all these different kinds of feminisms from different parts of the world. So I really want to acknowledge that. The second critical tool is this. It's not really a critical tool so much as the kind of line of vision is very much on these closer geographical and temporal scales. So things like the body, the household, community, the everyday. And this picture is, again, from Lampung, actually, of a household. And I just looking at that picture and thinking, you can diagnose power relations just by looking in that picture, the power of the state, the power to control that environment, the flooding, but then also the intra-household power. Who's standing at the front of the image? Who's at the back? Who's in the kitchen? And then the second kind of tool is really a concept more than anything, and this is this sort of concept of social reproduction and care, the spaces and relations through which life is made possible. So moving away from this very narrow focus on production, on commodification, on wage labor, but instead to sort of think about what is it that makes life possible, and for feminist political ecologists to extend that beyond just thinking about questions of care or domestic work, but to think about the material environmental dimensions of that, and how social reproduction also has this strong environmental thread. Wherever you are, it's not just a global south question or a rural question. We all depend on Earth, and that has just been hidden from us for a long time. In the kind of modern world, you can run through life without realizing about the way that the Earth is providing for you. So many things have hidden those sorts of relations from us in modern life. And then this final one is about predatory connection, the idea of these transnational or translocal connections, which are often predatory and which I think are most captured in feminist perspectives on extractivism as a particular kind of logic which exploits different kinds of spaces, and that's something we can kind of look at again as we go on. So back to Ibu Pandan. So here we are in West Kalimantan, where feminist political ecology tells us something about, well, what kinds of power relations are prevailing here? The kind of patriarchy that's associated with the oil palm company, the way that labor is structured within the oil palm company, the patriarchy that's wrapped up in a kind of colonial history of that landscape, and how it has been extracted in ways that have particularly disadvantaged women in terms of their access to resources, the distance they have to travel to get to their rice fields, as these rice fields are taken over by oil palm. The kind of questions around ecological and embodied health that surface in thinking about how particular people are positioned within these intersecting forms of power in ways that are damaging, particularly to the health of the ecologies in which they're trying to live, but also their own bodies. And then also the ways in which intersecting forms of power shape the burden of environmental responsibility when things such as a green transition or green economy is being imposed, and where that leaves some people if that's not subjected also to a consideration of intersecting forms of power. So Magdalena Pandan, as a Dayak woman, what's happened to her really is the sort of high value, cultural value that was attached to her economic role as a rice producer has been displaced and undermined by the coming of oil palm. And what's happened to her is she's now compensated through a wage which denigrates her and places her defines her as unskilled, and an unskilled labourer paid piece rate according to the amount of fertilizer applied to the trees that she's working on. So this intersection of capitalism, patriarchy, colonial logics here mean the economic benefit of oil palm is being extracted and accumulated elsewhere. Coming back to these predatory connections, just as the local and livelihood costs are being acutely felt by Magdalena Pandan and others like her. So we're focusing on the everyday and social reproduction. Again, thinking about Ibu Pandan's life here. And the story, which you can see on the video, is really a strong one of her day and how long her day is, and all of these different kinds of spaces in which she has to work. But feminist political ecology locates this kind of everyday embodied impacts of the transformation of large-scale oil palm for Dayak communities, as well as giving us the tools for understanding the relationships through which Magdalena Pandan is able to make a life in these new circumstances. So her multiple roles, she's combining farming, wage work, domestic work, childcare. This involves her contending with enclosure, commodification, dispossession, all of these big political ecology words. But what's that doing is changing access to control of resources in all sorts of different spaces, not just the fields, but also the home as well. So she has trouble finding access to clean water for domestic purposes. She no longer has access to forest resources that previous generations treated as a store cupboard of food and medicines. And she needs to engage in wage work on her oil palm plantation because rice farming alone can't meet the new costs that come with economic and environmental transformation. So the social reproduction lens, being able to actually look in detail at those processes and have those stories heard, is really an important side to the big stories of oil palm. So the little stories are also important through this focus on social reproduction as a concept that helps us with that. So extending that a little bit, there's also this idea around looking at sort of the everyday in a slightly different way. So we're thinking about the everyday in terms of body, household, and community, but we can also think about the everyday in terms of emotions, things that are sometimes off limits in academic, scientific research, but are so fundamental for understanding our connections, our disconnections as well. And feminist political ecology is not work that I've done myself, but I'm really inspired by the work that people have done when looking at questions around emotions and how those motivate, how they change those affective relationships with nature in various ways, what that can do. But there's also a sense in which political struggles for a better life can sometimes be missed if we don't think about some of these small and unspectacular forms of resistance and struggle that people engage with. So thinking about the kinds of spaces and sites of struggle in which women's voices are able to prevail. When we start to look at non-spectacular feminist political ecology, we can think about sometimes the other kinds of struggle for a better life that perhaps aren't spectacular, aren't exciting, or don't feel like they're challenging big P politics, but are nevertheless changing things in various ways. So in Magdalena Pandan's case, her response to oil palm transformation has been a hope-filled investment in her education for her children, the idea being to make them less vulnerable to future changes in forest livelihoods. So thinking about these as not to dismiss these kinds of hopes and aspirations as being non-political. They're political, but in a way that feminist political ecology would recognize as also important. So a question we might ask also is how thinking about these kinds of small acts can also help us also shape tools for the future and for future connection. And then finally, this predatory connections, thinking about Ibu Pandan again. And here in the image, a bucket with the pupuk for putting on the oil palm. A feminist political ecology analysis focuses on these wider structures, economic processes associated with corporate capitalism and extractive state power. And it reveals how the choices made by the powerful in transnational corporate boardrooms, government offices, these underpin the specificities of these rapid transformations taking place in Ibu Pandan's place. I think this is feminist political ecology's real power, is looking at these different kinds of scales of power, and to keep that idea on keep that attention on these wider structures. These transformations are also, and something not to miss, enabled and validated through a combination of particular kinds of knowledge, formal economic analyses, using things like how do you measure success? How do you measure success through profit? You measure success of the country through gross domestic product. Measuring things that actually are not capturing the well-being and health and of a society. So those kinds of knowledge politics are enabling particular types of development with a capital D to take place. Not only that, but perhaps certain forms of agricultural scientific knowledge, the colonizers' knowledge, has been pressed into service by the powerful, locking out the valuable knowledge of men and women in affected communities. And Magdalena Pandan's concerns about the impacts of chemicals on her body in the environment are also illustrative of the potential health and environmental risks to bodies in oil palm contexts such as hers. And we can extend that type of analysis to all different kinds of extractive contexts as well, in urban and rural areas. And so these extractive global connections are prompting a whole series of feminist political ecology approaches that connect with the environmentalism of the poor. So again, going back to, connecting academic knowledge with activist knowledge and with community knowledges to challenge environmental injustices associated with resource extraction and environmental degradation. So how to challenge predatory connections by fostering reciprocal connections through these kind of a convening space such as feminist political ecology. And one way of perhaps thinking about doing that is through what some researchers have referred to as counter-topographies. So in a sense, while these critical tools are important for identifying the problem, feminist political ecology is about so much more than this. A focus on extractivism and the impacts of economic growth on communities in the global south who are defending life-making and livelihoods has been important for sure. But how do we connect those struggles when, given that the extractivism itself is super connected through these global financial system and everything else? So counter-topography is a term borrowed from a geographer, Cindy Katz. It offers a geographical imagination that's translocal and transnational, used to analyze the common effects of processes associated with extractivism, dispossession and enclosure, privatization of commons. And here, FPE finds its form through movements for environmental justice, rights to a healthy environment campaigns in the global north too. So I mentioned earlier the example of anti-fracking or anti-oil drilling in the UK, which has inspired people. Lithium extraction in Portugal is attracting a lot of attention from activists. Youth climate justice movements also connecting and conversing between university, community and campaign in various extensive and diverse, and these are in various ways. And so what this, I think, is telling us is that the community of learners that make up feminist political ecology is broad, it's geographically extensive, and it's diverse in so many ways. And there's a renewed emphasis on these systemic questions, I think. They are about thinking about reversing the logic of extractive economic growth that depletes life in all its forms, recognizing the historical and economic legacies that mean this manifests in particular ways in different parts of the world, whether in the leafy suburbs of Surrey, the region close to where I live, with its hidden history, long history, of enclosure, used to be commons many years ago, centuries ago, but when capitalism first started off, industrialization removed the English peasantry from its land. So, there's a history there. It's a different history to what we've seen more recently. and whether we can, and how that kind of connects with Latin America's extractive zones, for example, where all sorts of feminist political ecology is emerging in really interesting ways. So it's a growing sense for me that it's necessary to amplify these hopeful stories and also to connect struggles within global systems. And there are many people doing this work. So I'm just a small, tiny ant in a big anthill of people doing this kind of work in so many inspiring ways. So one example of this was, one minute. One example that I was engaged in, sorry. Yeah, here we are. Yeah, so was a kind of experiment really with feminist political ecology as a convening space. And this was something that was initiated in Brighton and with its connections with Siti Maimuna and Dian Ekawati in a project led by Wendy Harcourt at the ISS in the Netherlands. And we, as a small part of that project, a few of us got together, had an exhibition, first of all, showing photographs from East Kalimantan about the children who died in the pits left behind after the open cast mines had closed. So, and this was Siti Mai's work, which she shared with people in Brighton. At that time, the climate crisis, there was a lot of activity from youth in Brighton, the youth climate activists, and we wanted to connect with them. Mai was very much wanting to tell them the story of Indonesia and where this climate crisis originates. So in extractivism, in the extractive carbon economy, and what that was meaning for people on the front line in East Kalimantan. And from this, we developed this project, which we called Extracting Us. It's changed slightly to Despite Extractivism, I think to recognize the way in which we wanted to think about these hopeful stories. So we invited people from all over, all sorts of places to join us in an exhibition. Originally, it was going to be in Brighton as part of a Pollen Political Ecology Conference. And then guess what? 2020, March, what happened? The pandemic. So we moved online, but weirdly that became a way of connecting differently. And we learned so much about new ways in which we might connect. So we learned stories from Amazonia, stories from all kinds of parts of the world of looking at the sort of communities and the creative contributions they were making through their activism and what we could learn together from them, and linking up our stories. So again, coming back to this idea of thinking about what questions we can ask together and what these questions can tell us. And we had a series of webinars where we got together and explored concepts like the body politics, community, what does that mean? And then also around about the sort of wider sort of global connections as well. So it was really, for me, I learned so much from that process, and it really taught me about how important this idea of convening space is. So and how we might try to engage with communities as part of that. So I think I want to kind of draw to a close. We'll begin to draw to a close. Sorry, I've been talking a long time. To think about these hopeful alternatives and to sort of follow in the spirit of Eve Tuck, an Indigenous scholar in North America, who reminds us that we should suspend damage-centered research, or not. We need to kind of acknowledge and research the damage, but not for that not to be our only point of contact. And to think about ways in which we can connect these different kinds of ecological feminisms. Don't put up borders and boundaries between ecofeminism, feminist political ecology, other kinds of movements, but instead connect up across these different geographical spaces, different parts of the world. And for me, I'm really curious to understand and to think about some of the ways, and to learn from you about some of the ways that Indonesian feminist political ecology. You might not want to label it in that way. Labels can be annoying and lock us in, but however that is expressed, how these can shape conversations. What can the rest of the world learn from community efforts here in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines also, to reclaim, to relearn, to resist? And the photograph at the top there, well, it's not a photograph, it's a drawing of a community garden in Brighton, where people are learning to kind of, in the spirit of recreating common land and common access to gardens and to growing food, to kind of try and step out of a toxic global industrial food system, and through that build new kinds of relations of connection, through that build new ways of living, actually, and to tackle some of the bigger issues around mental health and everything else that our toxic world has brought to us. And I think the dandelion, if any of you aren't familiar with this, it's seen as a weed. And thank you, Babette, for reminding us about dandelions when we were meeting earlier in the week. The dandelion is a flower that can grow through concrete, so it recolonizes urban areas in the UK and in other parts of the world. I think it's a sign for us, what we can all be dandelions. But the dandelion is also a really important flower, because you can eat the flower, you can eat the leaves in a salad, and the root you can turn into coffee. So it's a companion species that I think we should allow to and enable to flourish. But I don't think we need worry, because I think the dandelion is fighting back. So it's a flower with agency. And finally, so what I want to do is just wrap up really by saying, I'm sorry for speaking so long and in English. I hope, however, that I've given a bit of a flavour of feminist political ecology as a space through which any gap between academics, policymakers, communities and activists, where we can kind of work across those gaps, acknowledge this friction, stay with the trouble, live with the friction, but also try and work around through these kinds of gaps and acknowledge them and repair them in various ways. This hallmark of FPE is this commitment to careful collaborations between engaged people of all kinds who span the worlds of academia, policy, practice, and activism, where feminist perspective requires us to adopt a sort of spirit of self-reflexivity, always asking ourselves questions about our own positionality, questions about our situatedness, being open to multiple truths, open to more marginalized voices, and where this kind of feminist ethics can guide everyday practices of research, how we encounter each other, how we engage, how we act. So a good starting point is to think about what connects us, where we diverge, and I think FPE humbly offers a convening space to explore existing and future careful conversations and collaborations together. So thank you very much for staying with me.
Ya, terima kasih Becky. Kita beri tepuk tangan sekali lagi. Ada beberapa hal yang saya mungkin garis bawahi sebagai pemantik ya untuk diskusi, dan saya yakin kakak-kakak semua sudah tidak sabar untuk bertanya. Ada beberapa hal yang ini juga saya pelajari setelah mendengarkan kembali ya pemaparan Becky ya, bahwa FPE itu yang kita kenal Feminist Political Ecology memang menunjukkan komitmennya ya dalam konteks feminis, bukan hanya pada saat bagaimana pengetahuan itu diproduksi, tapi juga prosesnya gitu, prosesnya yang egaliter dan juga memperhatikan posisionalitas kita, bagaimana para pemikir-pemikir yang menggunakan FPE sebagai lensa analisis ataupun sebagai bagian dari aktivisme mereka, itu merupakan satu komunitas dari epistemis ya, kalau tadi istilahnya Becky gitu ya, dan pada saat proses menghasilkan pengetahuan atau proses produksi pengetahuan itu sendiri juga tadi Becky mengutip dari Donna Haraway ya, staying with trouble. Jadi kita mendengarkan pengalaman kelompok marginal, dalam ini perempuan dengan berbagai latar belakangnya, tentunya FPI sendiri juga tidak melihat perempuan sebagai satu kelompok yang monolitik gitu ya. Dan yang paling terakhir yang juga mungkin menarik juga nanti kita diskusikan adalah bagaimana FPI menawarkan kepada kita harapan gitu ya. Jadi ini saya pikirin juga penting. Mungkin hari-hari kita sebagai warga Indonesia yang setiap hari mungkin sudah bangun sudah penuh dengan keputusasaan mungkin gitu ya. Saya tidak tahu. Tapi FPI bisa menawarkan kita ataupun membuka diskusi bagaimana kita mungkin bukan cuma sekedar memikirkan bagaimana harapan-harapan itu muncul, juga bagaimana kita mengusahakan harapan-harapan tersebut, kolaborasi seperti apa gitu yang bisa muncul dalam konteks yang merawat gitu ya, yang careful satu dengan yang lainnya. Terima kasih Becky atas pemaparannya. Untuk diskusi sesi ini kita akan buka 3 dulu, 3, tapi sudah ada banyak yang bertanya. Apakah harus maju ke depan situ ya? Atau, oh ya, mic-nya ada di situ. Oke, 3 dulu mungkin, 4 mungkin ya. 2 dari sayap sebelah sini, 2 dari sayap sebelah sana. Apakah, kakak yang di depan yang pakai jilbab biru, kemudian yang di belakang yang pakai jilbab kuning ya? Ya, kakak, ya, 2. Kemudian yang sebelah sini ada kakak yang baju merah, ya, pakai kacamata, dan kakak yang di belakang. Ya, pakai baju hitam. Silakan.
Oh, bisa? Tes.
Cek. Oke, sudah kayaknya. Oke.
Nama ya, Kak?
Ya. Saya Eva dari Institut Sarinah. Saya terima kasih sekali dibantu untuk membuka mata ya, bagaimana FPI beroperasi ya, dan juga memperjelas bagaimana meletakkan bahwa perempuan sebagai korban. Nah, di dalam pencarian saya di feminisme Pancasila itu ini kedengaran seperti P4 ya, tetapi menurut saya ekstraktivisme itu tidak hanya kita harus menyoal tentang kapitalisme, tetapi kalau kita kaitkan dengan konstitusi dan Pancasila, itu betul-betul sangat melanggar Pancasila dan konstitusi. Jadi isunya bukan isu keadilan gender, tetapi ini isu kebangsaan bagi kami. Dan menurut feminisme Pancasila sebetulnya ketika kita data sudah dibuka melalui FPI, maka selanjutnya pertanyaannya adalah apa yang harus dikerjakan, dan karena ini isu kebangsaan maka pertanyaannya adalah bagaimana membawa pengambil keputusan atau pengambil kebijakan itu mengintegrasikan, misalkan ini kan sangat tidak sesuai dengan sila kedua maupun sila kelima, yaitu keadilan sosial yang tadi sudah juga sempat disebut ya. This is really against the social justice begitu. Nah, lalu bagaimana meletakkan untuk penyelesaian ya, bagaimana mengajak para komunitas ini, para perempuan ini untuk kemudian mempraktekkan, atau pemerintah juga mempraktekkan musyawarah mufakat. Nggak bisa kita untuk pendekatan ala klien, kemudian menyelesaikan dari perspektif akademik, kemudian tidak meletakkannya atau mengajak mereka untuk bersama-sama ke dalam pengambilan keputusan. Tadi pagi kami menghadiri UN Women Meeting ya, di situ diajak para perempuan yang menjadi korban dari 5 komunitas, beberapa juga hadir di sini, dan mereka tidak hanya resilience ya, tetapi juga mampu mencari solusi-solusi. Jadi menurut saya pandangan yang memberdayakan itu juga penting. Tidak boleh hanya berhenti bahwa yes, women as a victims gitu. Karena mereka ternyata punya kecerdasan lokal, punya juga knowledge lokal yang kemudian bisa untuk negosiasi tadi. Tapi saya gembira di akhir penutupan tadi ada harapan-harapan, dan mungkin apa yang saya kemukakan tadi adalah beberapa yang harus didialogkan ya antara FPI dan feminisme Pancasila. Itu saja, terima kasih.
Should we collect the questions first, yeah? And before you respond, or what do you prefer?
maybe for this one, it would be really interesting someone explain Pancasila feminism.
Mungkin Kak Eva bisa sedikit menjelaskan. Karena ini pertama kali mungkin untuk Becky mendengar feminisme Pancasila.
Oke, secara singkat sebetulnya feminisme Pancasila itu adalah pelaksanaan dari Pancasila, itu gampangnya. Ketika sudah tidak ada penindasan, ini di sila kelima ya, sila kelima keadilan sosial. Should I explain what Pancasila is? Ya, di dalam Indonesia kita punya 5 dasar ya. Yang pertama itu ketuhanan yang Maha Esa. Kemudian yang kedua kemanusiaan. Kemudian yang ketiga tentang persatuan atau nasionalisme. Kemudian yang keempat itu adalah demokrasi tetapi berbasis kepada musyawarah mufakat yang egalitarian. Nggak boleh kita gaya scholar, gaya akademik, kemudian melihat korban nggak diajak ngomong. Ini saya punya trauma ya untuk advokasi undang-undang PPRT. Jadi seperti itulah background saya. Kemudian yang kelima adalah social justice gitu. Jadi landasan etik untuk menyelesaikan persoalan-persoalan termasuk kesetaraan gender itu di situ. Jadi kita punya landasan etik yang dipakai untuk panduan bagaimana mencari penyelesaian. Jadi feminisme Pancasila adalah kesetaraan yang berbasis pada, ya ini bedanya dengan feminisme yang lain ya. Ketuhanan yang Maha Esa, the spirituality untuk gender equality itu seperti apa, kemudian kemanusiaan dan yang terakhir keadilan. Tetapi demokrasinya musyawarah mufakat. Jadi itu basis-basisnya seperti itu. Terima kasih.
Oke, kita kumpulkan dulu pertanyaannya, baru kemudian nanti akan direspon oleh Becky. Tadi ada kakak, ya silakan Kak.
Baik, terima kasih sebelumnya. Perkenalkan, nama saya Sri Rahayu dari Universitas Gadjah Mada. Kebetulan saya meriset mengenai teori yang saya gunakan ini tentunya FPA di Cilincing, dan saya menemukan bentuk agensi survival dan agensi transformatif. Lalu pertanyaan saya singkat saja, dalam kerangka Feminist Political Ecology, bagaimana cara kita membedakan secara analitis antara agensi perempuan yang bersifat survival sama agensi yang bersifat benar-benar itu transformatif. Dan apakah FPA ini harus mempunyai output yang berbentuk transformatif dari kelompok perempuan itu sendiri dalam menghadapi kerusakan iklim? Sekian, terima kasih.
Terima kasih Kak Sri. Baik, yang dua penanya dari sayap sebelah kanan. Ya.
Tes. Thank you. My name is Amalia. Saya dari Kementerian PPPA. First, thank you very much for the opportunity and thank you for the insightful lecture. I have previously engaged with your work when examining child marriage in disaster-affected areas, particularly to understand how environmental shocks intersect with gender vulnerabilities in less visible ways. Drawing on your work in Indonesia, how do resource-based development and crisis contexts shape women's and girls' vulnerabilities that often remain invisible in our policy frameworks? And what should governments be particularly careful about when translating these insights into policy responses? Thank you very much.
Terima kasih Ama. Ya, satu lagi kakak. Nanti kami minta untuk teman-teman yang bertanya untuk bicara lebih pelan supaya interpreter bisa lebih mudah untuk mengikuti.
Tes. Baik, terima kasih. Perkenalkan, nama saya Rama. Saya dari Palangkaraya, Kalimantan Tengah. Terima kasih. Ya, Saya mewakili suara perempuan-perempuan yang ada di Kalimantan Tengah. Sebelum saya mengajukan pertanyaan, saya akan menceritakan sedikit fakta yang terjadi di sana, terutama di Kalimantan Tengah, bahwa ada salah satu perempuan yang merupakan petani aktif di Kalimantan Tengah, namun akibat dari perusahaan sawit, perkebunan sawit, perempuan dan ibu-ibu yang terbiasa menanam padi di daerah sana kehilangan lahannya dan tidak ada lagi aktivitas untuk menanam padi. Jadi apabila tidak ada aktivitas penanam padi, maka benih-benih lokal itu akan punah di daerah sana. Apabila benih-benih lokal hilang dan punah di daerah sana, maka terputus juga vegetasi-vegetasi lokal yang ada di Kalimantan Tengah seperti itu. Dan ini sudah terjadi dan sangat di Kalimantan Tengah. Jadi pertanyaan saya berkaitan dengan itu, dengan ekologi politik feminis ini, apa strategi untuk perempuan yang kehilangan hak, kehilangan lahan untuk menanam padi, untuk mempertahankan benih-benih lokal yang ada di Kalimantan Tengah. Terima kasih. Oke.
Terima kasih Kak Rama. Okay, Becky, you want to respond to the questions? First question is about the Pancasila feminism, and then especially I think focus how we could, let's say, push the government into this, kind of a more democratic decision making. And the second one is about, I think it's more about theoretical, how we could draw FPE in understanding, the agency of the women, whether it's where we could draw the line between a survival and transformative agency. And the third question is about, how the policy framework shape the vulnerability situations and how what government should pay attention to drawing, like based on your experience and in focusing on resource-based livelihoods. And then the fourth questions, what strategies? Then that's again the questions comes that we should take, or the women with the situations, facing palm oil expansions.
Well, thank you very much for those questions. Really insightful questions, but also difficult questions in some ways, for which feminist political ecology in itself probably doesn't have the answer, if that makes any sense. So, but let me see how I can respond to each one. So, Ibu Efa, you are asking about about Pancasila feminism and holding power to account and ways in which to do that. And I think this comes back to if I had the answer. If I had the answer, maybe we wouldn't be in this room. It feels like this is just an ongoing struggle. I mean, really, in the UK, we are also facing an increasingly a democratic deficit. It's something that's happening everywhere. The kind of rise of making. I mean, I call this topic "challenging times" for a good reason, and I think this is where perhaps. I can't give you an answer, but what I can do is maybe I think, as I hope the talk probably showed, was what the tools need to be to kind of work towards an answer, which is bringing as many people into the room as possible. And that would include people in power, actually. So I think sometimes there's a kind of shying away from some of those questions. And I don't know how straightforward this is in the Indonesian context, but sometimes there's surprising moments, perhaps. A conversation in a corridor, or I was talking about small p politics in the everyday, and the ways in which sometimes you can change people's minds in very small ways. This might seem like a little bit naive, I think, but it's something that you have to keep trying, but also to not close down those connections with power, but to also be reflexive all the time about what you're walking into. But I feel like humbly, probably you know this better than I do about how to do this. So I don't feel like I want to try and give you an answer. I think your experience, your local experience, the way you answer these kinds of questions is very situated. And so actually someone from the UK would not be able to give you an answer to that. But I hope that the kind of like, how would I say, the approach of FPE is about bringing people into the room, the right people into the room, and I might not be the right person to bring into the room to answer that particular question. So it's a little bit also about knowing who to ask those questions with, who and how to press. So I would probably know how I would deal with the people in power in my community and what works. But I think it's different in every place, and it changes as well. And so this is about also having to be very, very versatile. And I think there's some very, very worthwhile stories from the past in Indonesia of how that kind of thing has happened. I mean, Professor Saparinah's story from 1998 and what followed, I think, is a good example of that, actually. So I know times have changed and times are changing, but I do feel that there's those moments, seizing those moments with the right people at the right time, and being, I guess, amenable to those people in power. I don't know. I'm really conflicted about people in power being within these convening spaces. I think there's a time and a place. Hati-hati, maybe is the way to go about it. But I don't know if it doesn't really answer your question. I think what it's saying is a feminist political ecology. Perhaps it's not like a book of answers to problems. It's more like thinking about what are the tools that we might be able to assemble and modify and use for ourselves to get where we need to go. So maybe I'll leave it with that as the answer. But thank you for your question. And yeah, I'm familiar with Pancasila, but I hadn't really kind of thought through Pancasila feminism. So I think that's interesting for me. So the second question is Nira Hayu from Gajah Mada. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. This is the question around survival agency and transformative agency. I wonder whether there's such a strong binary between those two, and that very often in particular circumstances, a survival agency can actually be transformative before people realize it. So again, it comes back to how power works. And power can work from small things and then unintentionally perhaps be transformative. So transformation, it depends what you're talking about. Transformation of what? And if it's about a transformation of thinking, can often come through people being in a room together, experiencing something, talking about something, and some change happens. So I would maybe caution against that really strong binary between those two. I think they connect in interesting ways, and almost tracing those connections is perhaps an interesting way of doing your analysis, but also thinking about moments where that's happened in challenging climate crisis. So yeah, and your work, I'm sure, will point you to all of those sorts of moments in your particular context. Hermelia, I don't know if I pronounced your name, Hermelia, about policy translation. Well, again, I think in some ways my answer to this might be a little similar to the answer to the first question, because I feel like there are some things that perhaps we could point governments towards in terms of what needs to be paid attention to. But I think in a way that's some of the questions around how to deal with these systemic issues are very difficult to deal with a set of policy recommendations, because they are things that there is all sorts of interests that would be unsettled by thinking about some of these environmental questions in that way. But I think there are some key things around, actually listening to communities more, I think that is something that doesn't happen enough. And perhaps the ways that those listening spaces need to be convened in a different way, in a way that's more inclusive and in a way that people are genuinely heard, but also thinking about how people define the problems that they're facing themselves, rather than that being a kind of expert knowledge, taking, with a small visit to a community, prescribing some things that need to happen in that community. So it's a little bit about more humility in how we work and in terms of, I guess, collaborations in terms of those policy conversations, rather than that only being a kind of expert knowledge. I don't think that's unique to Indonesia. I mean, I see that happening in my own community, where it's very difficult for people to engage because they're not being asked in the right way. So maybe it's those. That's probably where I would leave that one. And then Pak Tarama from Palangkaraya, Central Kalimantan. Yeah, I'm very sad about what I'm hearing from that part of Indonesia, and how the sort of, I guess, how extractive agriculture, oil palm, and everything else that's happening is creating these, causing some things to be lost that shouldn't be lost. But I think this is a process that I've been hearing today, just in the workshops we've been having, talking about the Philippines context and the Indonesia context, about these kinds of, I guess, varieties of seeds, these things that are so important, how there's also a kind of movement towards trying to kind of keep those and hang on to those. Again, I think the answer to that is not for me to give you the answer, but to think about how that these questions can be asked, with who, and to kind of map out, well, who do you need to be asking these questions, or how like who you would want to gather in that convening space that would address that issue. Because I don't think it's an issue where it's endemic the world over, this kind of simplification of agriculture, and the sort of ways in which we can respond to that, I think, needs a kind of responsibility that can come from making the right kinds of connections, and again, the tools of feminist political ecology is more like an orientation to thinking about connections and how important those are for kind of answering those questions. So I'm sorry I can't give you a simple answer from my back pocket, but I think that's a very much in the spirit of FPE, is to avoid doing that, and instead to think holistically about how to work together on these. And I think you find that by making connections with other places in the world where this is happening, you gather strength. So that's also a call for that to be perhaps one strategy that might be.
Terima kasih. Thank you, Becky. Saya mau tanya dulu, ya ada penanya dari Zoom ya. Apakah boleh dibacakan atau bagaimana? So we collect questions from the Zoom participants now.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you introduce yourself first, ya, Kak?
Thanks for the confirmation and opportunity. My name is Steven. I am a worker in an NGO, International NGO, Students for Liberty. Also, my education background is international relations. So this relates to educational background. What's the next question I can ask for the speaker, to the speaker? Because speakers is really interesting for me. Okay, got it. Thank you. My question is, this is relates to my undergraduate thesis. My undergraduate thesis is about climate justice. I use it as a lens in international collaboration or cooperation. But I want to know from the speaker, what is the intersection of climate justice and FPE? So, I mean, uh, and maybe you can add some explanation. What is the difference between ecofeminism? So, yeah, it's a theoretical question, but please answer it. Thank you.
Ya, halo Mbak, kedengaran nggak Mbak suaranya? Ya, uh, yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. Hi Becky, my name is Reza. I'm gender studies student. This is actually my last semester in gender studies Universitas Indonesia. So I'm currently conducting my field work. Basically, I'm staying in East Kalimantan. So I'm currently conducting my thesis research in oil palm plantation, one of oil palm plantation in East Kalimantan. So my research is basically focusing on the exploitation of female domestic workers within this capitalist industry. So the oil palm plantation. So as you mentioned earlier in your presentations, while staying with the trouble among these workers, so I'm focusing to trying to collecting the data within the domestic workers here. So they basically oil palm plantations labor, but the sectors of work is domestic work. So they work with the managerial staff like HR, the administrations that work in the office. So while staying with the trouble among these workers, I have noticed a profound absence of emotions. It feels, I'm speaking with robots, I'm speaking with machine, not human. So I know that based on what you were explained earlier about feminist political ecology emphasizes the everyday, embodied, and emotional aspect of life. So I feel that the emotional element here seems to have vanished. So using the FPE as a critical tool, how can I uncover and understand the emotions of this woman? Emotions that appear to have been lost or extracted by the palm oil industry. So that is basically my questions. Thank you.
sorry for mispronouncing your name, and you're working in East Kalimantan on oil palm. Well, and your project sounds fascinating, really interesting. And if I understand you right, you're investigating the domestic workers working in the office, and some of what they're experiencing within these very sort of extractive areas. Without knowing too much about those people, are they migrants, or were they like local community who've been introduced into that work? I think the absence of emotions and what you're perceiving as an absence of emotions is kind of interesting, and I think it's really a methodological question as well. Is that where would emotions be revealed? How would you know that you're not seeing people's emotions? I think there's something about the psychology of emotions that people they're talking like they're robots, or and this might be a number of things, and this is perhaps where a kind of thinking about some of these questions through the ways that FPE might connect with psychology, for example, I think is also really, really an interesting one. So it's difficult to sort of diagnose without understanding more about what's going on there, but it could be all sorts of things. So your reflection on that, I think, is really good, that's what you're doing. That's an FPE way of working, is to think, why is this happening? Because it could be to do with the ways the questions are being asked. It could be to do with public, what's seen in public, and then the emotions that are hidden. There's many things that could be going on there. So, but it's not really surprising that there's an absence of emotions for people working in a traumatic context. So that might be another thing, is how we work with trauma. And again, coming back to the sort of ethics of research, is when the one thing that you can't do is start probing people for, their emotions. There's a feminist ethics would say that careful research means really taking care with the safety of those people that you're researching with. So, but it sounds fascinating. So I look forward to hearing some more. Thank you.
Terima kasih, Becky. Baik, kita masih ada waktu dua lagi ya, 2 dari sayap kiri, 2 dari sayap kanan. Kakak yang pakai jilbab biru, kemudian kakak yang di belakang, ya, yang sebelahnya Livi, ya betul. Kemudian 2 dari sebelah sini, tadi sebenarnya kakak yang pakai kacamata, ya, baju merah, ya itu, 1. Ya kakak, jangan ke belakang, nah ya. 1 lagi, oke, yang pakai baju putih, ya silakan. Pelan-pelan ya Kak.
Ya, terima kasih. Perkenalkan, nama saya Herni. Saya pengajar di Prodi Ilmu Komunikasi di Universitas BSI. Kebetulan riset saya juga tentang gender gitu.
Siapa Kak?
Nama saya Herni.
Herni.
Ya. Saya sedikit bercerita tentang temuan riset yang saya lakukan. Kebetulan riset saya itu ada di Kota Batu, Jawa Timur. Temuan yang saya temukan pada penelitian saya itu misalnya ketika kebetulan seorang dosen itu melakukan kegiatan pengabdian masyarakat di tingkat kelurahan gitu ya. Ketika kita mengundang mereka untuk datang di acara kegiatan pengabdian masyarakat kita, misalnya temanya adalah parenting gitu ya. Ternyata yang datang itu adalah pihak ibu-ibu, bapak-bapak itu mereka tidak datang. Alasannya kenapa? Karena mereka ke sawah. Padahal suami istri itu sama-sama ke sawah. Tapi ketika kegiatan parenting itu mereka yang mau datang adalah atau bapak-bapaknya tidak bisa datang, tapi meminta istrinya itu untuk datang kegiatan pengabdian masyarakat kita sebagai dosen. Kemudian kalau misalnya kita membuat suatu kegiatan pengabdian kepada masyarakat itu adalah penguatan organisasi BUMDes. Di desa itu ada BUMDes, Bu. Nah, kemudian yang datang itu otomatis laki-laki karena memang di dalam BUMDes itu ada nilai ekonomisnya gitu loh. Otomatis mereka tidak menyuruh istrinya untuk datang ke kegiatan BUMDes itu tadi, tapi dengan apa keikhlasan mereka akan datang si bapaknya itu. Nah, kemudian pertanyaan saya adalah bagaimana ekonomi politik feminis melihat ini. Kemudian apakah masih perlu diberlakukan atau diadakan kegiatan pemberdayaan jika memang perempuan-perempuan di daerah, di desa itu faktanya seperti itu. Begitu pertanyaan saya. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Kak Herni. Kakak yang di belakang, silakan.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity. The honorable speaker and moderator, Madam Professor. My name is Lalu Budi Setiawan. I work as a correctional officer and also a Master of Law student. And I'm from Lombok, by the way. Nice to meet you, Professor. So thank you for the discussion. I gained so many points and so many valuable insight from this discussion about FPE. So if we consider the landscape of Indonesian environmental politics currently dominated by the logic of rapid economic growth, FPE exists not merely as a theory, but as a radical meeting space. FPE works by reconnecting the relationship between global environmental degradation and the physical and emotional burden felt by women at the household level. FPE also reminds us that when a forest is cleared or a river is polluted, what is lost is not just a commodity, but rather a life support system that has long been managed by women through unpaid care work. However, in Indonesia itself, my personal thinking, the most significant legal instrument hindering the current FPE agenda today is the Job Creation Law, or Law number 6 of 2023, also we known as the Omnibus Law. This law, by the way, in its effort to attract investment, is often gender blind, simplifying the environmental permitting process and limiting public participation. Consequently, the voice of women without formal land certificates are often silenced in the environmental impact assessment, or we known as AMDAL process, leaving them isolated on their own lands. So my question is, in the middle of the massive push for the job creation law, which can FPE transform from a mere meeting space for discussion into a competitive power space that legally force the state to recognize the economic value of care work and women's ecological rights as a key of national sovereignty? I mean, how can this narrative of women's struggle or women resistance be integrated into legal documents to support an environmental struggle in court? And the second one, Madam Professor, based on your research in Asia, especially in Indonesia, so what recommendation do you have used for policy hearing on gender and environmental justice? And what is the strategic and concrete steps can this country take? That's all from me. Thank you for your attention.
Terima kasih Kak Budi. Kedua penanya di sebelah kanan. So this is the last round. Okay. Kak, ya.
Terima kasih Mbak Haryati. Hello Beka, I'm Fitri. I'm alumni of Kajian Gender. My question is, what is your personal reflection during your research? If I'm not mistaken, you are since 1994 here, and maybe you can share with us what is your maybe the most impression or your personal reflection during your activity, and what is your something that you feel it's still homework for your research or your activities in with the FPE analysis tools? Thank you so much.
Terima kasih Kak Fitri. Yeah.
Professor, my name is Dewi Arilaha. I'm working in the policy arena. You mentioned repeatedly on lived experiences, the empirical experiences of Ibu Magdalena. Then you repeatedly mentioned about the community of practice, community of learners. And there is this questions, policy questions from the Ministry of Child Protections and Women Empowerment, which is asking the policy forward for women empowerment. My question really, you were asking in your closing remarks, how will Indonesia shape the conversations of feminist political ecology? Professor, from your vast experience, could I ask, From these three things, the lived experiences, the community of practice, and policy questions, as we all understand that the environmental questions are getting more relevant with the current happenings around the world. But then again, if we're talking about shaping the conversations, the questions always comes back to a cohesive identity, not only of ecological, not only of economical, but also something which has to be political, because policy is politics. Policy should bring welfare and protection, regardless of the gender. So now the question, Professor, from our collective experiences and strengths, let's say if we are to build the community of practice, how shall we organize and consolidate the strengths moving forward? Thank you.
Makasih, Kak Dewi. So, Becky? You got the questions, right?
Yes, so the first question was from Hermi. And yes, thank you for sharing about your story of your research in East Java. Yeah, and I mean, I'm really struck by how enduring gender roles can be. And I think I wish there was an answer for how to kind of unravel those or push those in different ways. And there's been all sorts of experiments of how to do that in other parts of the world as well, and with financial incentives and, for example, in the UK, the kind of stuff around wages for housework, but then paternity leave, because often these sort of gender roles, even in very progressive households where there's sharing of domestic work and childcare, there's something about the sort of engagement with the state and the workplace that makes those roles get reinforced again. And so it's perhaps looking also at sort of how enabling structures, rather than thinking of this as always being a cultural thing. That's clearly important around people's identity, but I think these are sorts of questions to be asking in particular contexts, and to look for the ways in which certain kinds of structures can kind of maintain that. And it can be really simple things sometimes, but also what is it that needs to be undone and why? And there's something about the way in which childcare, particularly, being the answer to questions around childcare being things that means to give women freedom, you can modify the childcare, but then that just becomes like a reinforcing form of extractivism in some way. So there's some real complexities around this. So again, I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you a simple answer, but just to say, I think there's various questions that perhaps FPE would help you, would kind of, I guess, encourage you to ask about that situation and what's going on, and to look at these different layers of power that have created that situation in the first place. But that enduring gender roles is not unique to your place. I think we see this everywhere in the world, and how, you know, there's some power that women might keep from maintaining a role. So that's another thing to sort of think about. It's not a straightforward piece. The second question from Satyawan. Yes. Apologies again for not quite hearing your name pronunciation. Yes, I've read about this omnibus law and some of the things that it's there to do, and some of the things that it's doing, and maybe the whole question around attracting investment. I think your question really centered around the kind of impact assessment. Am I right? The EIA, I think we would call it in the UK. Have I misunderstood that? Or is it? Yeah. So, and actually, for looking at that from a sort of feminist political ecology point of view, I mean, the EIA is interesting because it's a tool of power. I mean, it's designed to protect the environment, but then you kind of have to think about the forms of knowledge that it privileges, and the forms of experience that are denied and not captured in an EIA. Now, I don't know what you do about this, particularly in Indonesia, but in other parts of the world, there's movements for kind of reshaping these EIAs so that they do try to acknowledge different kinds of knowledge and connection with land that go beyond this sort of economic calculus, or kind of seeing the environment in terms of environmental services. And I read a really interesting article that's from a political ecologist working in Canada. I don't know if you've come across Karen Backer's work, but this is a joint paper that she wrote with an Indigenous person from a community, and it was looking at a kind of dam development in British Columbia. And they did they tried to mesh this Indigenous knowledge and with the EIA process. And they gave up, these researchers. She said that it's just not possible. So what they did as a thought experiment in this article was write what an Indigenous, something like an environmental impact assessment would look like. And it was fascinating. So it was like telling an ancestral story. Anyway, I don't know that you can exactly encourage policymakers to start to use storytelling as a mode of environmental impact assessment, but why not? So I wonder whether there's just sort of ways of pushing for different ways of valuing the environment, different way that I'm sure those conversations are going on in Indonesia. There'll be people, you probably are doing it yourself. I don't know, but I think FPE would be as a convening space would be where you could sort of bring in these different. You bring in these different sorts of ideas. So I don't think FPE has the answers, but it's, I guess, just listening to your question, that's where my mind would go in terms of thinking about how you would then deconstruct that particular situation and how you might then start to ask the right kinds of questions of the situation. And then where I got to the last question about my personal reflection. Oh my goodness. Well, yeah. I mean, where to start? All I can say is that I started doing research in Indonesia when I was very young, and I'm very naive, and went to a village trying to kind of understand transmigrasi in Lampung, in an area of where at that time people who were being defined as forest squatters were being resettled in the northern areas of the province. And actually, I suppose my main reflection is about how, as I've grown older and taken with me some of that learning, my positionality and how I kind of what I see when I'm in Indonesia changes. Those two are not disconnected. So I suppose what I'm saying is my sort of reflection is there's been so many changes in the country, but then also so many things that have endured. But I think the thing that I found the most rewarding, valuable, amazing, life-changing has been actually the connection with the people that I've met and worked with, or just even in passing, and communities that I've stayed with, and how much I've learned from them, and bringing that home to my students in Brighton, being able to tell the stories, connecting them with Indonesia in ways that I think they know Indonesia through Bali holidays. So let's show. How to kind of create those connections. But I suppose my sort of final reflection really on that is how I think there's so much strength in women's movement here in this country, and how much to learn from people who are part of that. And I feel really privileged to have been given this chance in my life to do this, and how much I've been able to sort of take home and share in other spaces, in other settings. So I think that just being able to talk at an event like this, have so many difficult and thoughtful questions coming from the audience, and to see also like what's hugely makes my heart sing is all of these young strong women with voices and a real curiosity about their place and about what can happen in Indonesia. So it gives me a lot of hope, actually. So I think this is my reflection, really, and just finally say thank you so much for all of your generosity and for welcoming me into Indonesia. And last reflection is just how nice your food is. So. Oh, yeah, sorry. And I missed the last question, which is almost the most important question. As a community of learners, a cohesive identity that's political, how we might build that, how to organize. I don't know that there's a single cohesive identity that is possible to build. I think this shape shifts and is mutable depending on the situation, but perhaps it's a little bit around a feminist ethics of connection and hearing each other, listening respectfully and valuing people's perspectives, but then knowing when it's necessary to sort of speak back, to speak truth to power as well. But I'm encouraged because I think there have been all sorts of points where that kind of cohesive identity has converged around a particular problem. So very often I think that's where cohesion comes, is where people are experiencing something, the conversations open up, and that's when you're able to, for that moment, the cohesive identity looks that kind of a way, but then it might change and shift shape when new kinds of challenges present themselves. So I guess it's thinking about what that cohesive identity might be for this moment that we're facing. But I'd encourage you to think about a cohesive identity that goes beyond the boundaries of the Indonesian nation, and to think about, those connections with other parts of the world where very challenging things are happening as well. I know Indonesia has been very much involved with supporting people in very difficult conflicts in Gaza, for example. So I'd like to just say it's those kind of other kinds of connections that I think are super important. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Becky. Please give applause. Karena waktu sudah lewat dari waktu yang sudah ditentukan, sayangnya kita harus akhiri diskusi kita sore hari ini. Tetapi tentunya seperti yang kita sudah dengarkan dari Becky, bahwa FPI itu justru membantu kita untuk bukan hanya menemukan jawaban gitu, tetapi bagaimana bertanya, menanyakan kepada siapa, dan itu membangun satu diskusi terus menerus. Tadi ya, komunitas kita sebagai komunitas dengan komitmen feminis begitu, yang penuh dengan konteks merawat, etika merawat begitu, sehingga seringkali jawaban yang ada mungkin tidak hanya satu, tetapi mungkin ada beberapa jawaban yang sangat tergantung pada konteksnya. Dan semoga itu menjadi pembicaraan terus-menerus di antara kita, teman-teman yang peduli dengan isu yang berhubungan, khususnya yang berhubungan langsung dengan isu lingkungan, penghidupan yang berbasis sumber daya, tetapi isu-isu lain yang sangat berhubungan, terutama dalam konteks kita saat ini gitu ya, bagaimana kita menghadapi berbagai persoalan akibat dari krisis iklim. Terima kasih atas partisipasi dan respon dari kakak-kakak kehadirannya, dan terima kasih untuk Becky. Thank you very much for your insightful speech and then materials that we could discuss today. Saya akan kembalikan kepada MC. Kami tetap di sini. Terima kasih.
Kita berikan aplaus sekali lagi di sore hari ini. Untuk itu, dengan kasih kami meminta kesediaan Mbak Mia untuk memberikan tanda kasih kepada moderator dan juga pembicara kita di sore menjelang malam hari ini.
So, Becky, this is a weekly product is like a women's word and the symbol of the local knowledge, also symbol of collaboration because many people involved in this project. So when you
Kita berikan aplaus sekali lagi. Ya. Mungkin panitia bisa mengambil gambar sebentar. Oke, sudah? Silakan teman-teman panitia. Dalam hitungan ketiga, 1, 2, 3. Foto bersama langsung. Para tamu undangan, Bapak Ibu dosen, mungkin bisa mengambil tempat di depan, kita mau mengabadikan momen. Mbak Kristi, Mbak Ani, dan semua dosen yang berkenan hadir pada sore hari ini, mohon kesediaannya untuk ada di depan. Kita ambil gambar bersama. Baik Lila, Mbak Seli, para dosen yang masih ada dalam ruangan ini mungkin bisa merapat di depan, kita mengambil gambar bersama. Mbak Seli, Mbak Ik. Tim dari Anugerah Saparinah Sadli boleh juga berkenan untuk bergabung mengambil gambar bersama. Silakan teman-teman panitia. Teman-teman peserta jangan dulu bubar karena kita mau mengambil gambar sekali lagi. Mas Boni? Mas Boni? Oke, teman-teman peserta mungkin bisa langsung merapat ke depan. Bapak Ibu dosen jangan dulu berpindah tempat. Kita masih foto lagi. Silakan teman-teman peserta merapat ke depan. Kita akan mengambil gambar sekali lagi. Para peserta mungkin bisa merapat ke depan. Oke. Prof Becky, Mbak Haryati, Mbak Mia, dan para dosen mungkin kita merapat lagi ke depan untuk mengambil gambar sekali lagi bersama peserta. Kita belum tutup. Udah.